The alarm bells screamed through the corridors of the New Horizon as Captain Jake Morrison gripped his command chair. The ship shook violently, throwing crew members against bulkheads and sending loose equipment flying across the bridge. Red warning lights bathed everything in an angry glow while the main computer announced system failures in its cold, mechanical voice. "Engine core breach in Sector 7, shouted Engineer Beth Walker from her station. "We're losing power to the main drives. I can't stop it from here." Jake's knuckles turned white as he held on. The ship carried 847 souls, all hoping to start new lives on the colony world of Haven's Rest. Now they were trapped in a dying vessel millions of miles from anywhere safe. "How long do we have?" Jake asked, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "Maybe 10 minutes before total engine failure," Beth replied, her fingers dancing across her control panel. "After that, we'll be flying a very expensive rock." Dr. Lisa Hamilton, the colony's chief scientist, pulled herself up from where she had fallen. Blood trickled from a cut on her forehead, but she ignored it. "Captain, I'm reading a planet in this system. It's close enough for emergency landing procedures." Jake turned to his navigation officer. "Put it on screen." The main display showed a brown and tan world spinning slowly in the darkness. No blue oceans, no green continents, just endless stretches of what looked like desert sand. It looked dead and hostile, like something from humanity's worst nightmares. "That's Xerion Prime," Dr. Hamilton said, checking her readings. "The Zephyrian Empire has it marked as uninhabitable. Class 5 death world, no water, extreme temperatures, toxic atmosphere in some regions." "Sounds wonderful," Jake muttered. "Any other options?" "Negative, sir. It's this or deep space." Another violent shake ran through the ship. Sparks flew from damaged control panels, and the lights flickered. Jake could hear the distant sound of emergency crews running through the corridors, trying to save what they could. "All hands, this is the captain," Jake announced over the ship's communication system. "Prepare for emergency landing. This is not a drill. Secure all loose items and report to your designated emergency stations. We're going down." The next few minutes passed in a blur of activity. Emergency crews worked frantically to prepare the ship for crash landing. Parents gathered their children close while others said quiet prayers. The colony's leader, Mayor Pete Johnson, moved through the ship trying to calm people and keep order. Carl Rodriguez, the ship's maintenance chief, was in the engine room trying to keep the power systems stable. He had worked on ships for 20 years, but he had never seen damage this bad. Coolant leaked from broken pipes, and the main reactor was making sounds that no reactor should ever make. "Come on, baby," he whispered to the ship. "Just hold together a little longer." The ship's computer began its final descent calculations. Jake fought with the controls, trying to find a flat area large enough for their massive vessel. The planet's surface rushed up toward them, growing larger and more detailed by the second. "There," Dr. Hamilton pointed at the screen. "That flat area between those two mountain ranges, it looks like an ancient riverbed, a dried riverbed on a planet with no water," Jake said grimly. "Perfect." The ship hit the atmosphere with a sound like thunder. The hull groaned and protested as it heated up from the friction. Jake could feel the vessel fighting him, wanting to tumble end over end. He used every trick he knew to keep them stable. "Brace for impact," he shouted into his microphone. The New Horizon hit the desert surface with tremendous force. The ship bounced once, twice, then skidded across the sand for what felt like forever. Metal screamed against rock. Windows shattered. Systems failed one by one until finally, after what seemed like hours, but was probably only minutes, everything went quiet. Jake opened his eyes and found himself hanging upside down in his chair. His head hurt, and he could taste blood in his mouth. Slowly, he unbuckled himself and dropped to what had been the ceiling. "Damage report," he called out weakly. "Hull breach in sections 12 through 15, came Beth's voice from somewhere, in the darkness. "Main power is down. Emergency power is holding, but barely. We're alive, but we're not going anywhere." Dr. Hamilton's voice crackled through the emergency communication system. "Captain, we have injuries throughout the ship. Nothing fatal so far, but we need to get people to the medical bay." Jake pulled himself to his feet and looked out through the cracked bridge windows. The alien landscape stretched endlessly in all directions. Sand dunes rose and fell like frozen waves. The sky was a strange orange color, and two small suns hung in the distance. "Listen up, everyone," Jake announced to the ship. "We're down, but we're alive. That's what matters. Emergency teams, begin evacuation procedures. Everyone else, stay calm and wait for instructions." Over the next few hours, the survivors worked together to evacuate the ship. They set up temporary shelters using emergency supplies and began taking stock of their situation. The news was not good. Their water recycling systems were damaged beyond repair. Food supplies would last maybe 3 months if they were careful. The communication array was destroyed, so they could not call for help. Most of their advanced equipment was either broken or running on failing power cells. Mayor Johnson gathered the colony's leaders in the largest shelter. "We need to be honest with ourselves," he said. "We're stranded on a world that the Zephyrians say is uninhabitable. We have limited supplies and no way to call for rescue." "The Zephyrians might detect our crash," suggested Dr. Hamilton. "They have monitoring stations in this system." Carl Rodriguez shook his head. "Even if they do, why would they risk a rescue mission? They think this planet is deadly. They'll probably just mark us as casualties and move on." Jake looked around at the faces of his people. They were scared, tired, and far from home. But they were alive, and they were human. That had to count for something. "We've survived worse," he said firmly. "Our ancestors crossed oceans in wooden boats and walked across frozen continents with nothing but their courage. We can figure this out." Outside their shelter, the alien wind howled across the empty desert, carrying with it the promise of challenges yet to come. 3 days after the crash, the water situation became critical. The emergency supplies were running low, and the damaged recycling systems could only process a fraction of what the colony needed. People were already on strict rationing, receiving just enough water to stay alive. Carl Rodriguez watched the sunrise through the shelter's small window. The 2 suns of Xerion Prime painted the desert in shades of gold and orange, but the beauty could not hide the danger they all faced. His throat felt dry, and his lips were already cracking from dehydration. "We need to find water," Mayor Johnson said during the morning meeting. "Our supplies won't last another week." Dr. Hamilton spread out her geological scanner readings on the makeshift table. "I've been studying the area around our crash site. The good news is that we landed in what looks like an ancient riverbed. The bad news is that any water disappeared thousands of years ago." "What about underground sources?" asked Jake Morrison. "Rivers don't just vanish completely." "Possibly, but we would need to dig down maybe 100 feet or more. With our limited equipment, that could take months we don't have." Carl listened to the discussion while thinking about his childhood. He remembered visiting his grandfather's farm in rural Kansas, where the old man had taught him strange things that city people called foolish. One of those things suddenly seemed very important. "My grandfather could find water," Carl said quietly. The others looked at him with surprise. Engineer Beth Walker raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "Back on Earth, my grandfather lived in a dry area where wells sometimes ran empty. He used to walk around with a forked stick, and somehow he could tell where to dig for water. He called a dowsing." Beth shook her head. "That's just superstition, Carl. There's no scientific basis for water dowsing." "Maybe not," Carl replied. "But my grandfather never dug a dry well. He found water for half the county that way." Dr. Hamilton frowned. "Even if such a technique worked on Earth, this is an alien world. The geology is completely different." "Water is water," Carl said stubbornly. "And we're desperate enough to try anything." Jake looked around the group. "What would you need?" Carl thought for a moment. "A forked stick, basically. 2 branches that come together at a point. But we don't have trees here, so I'd need to make something similar from metal." "I have some flexible conduit and the repair supplies," Beth said reluctantly. "But I still think this is a waste of time." "We have time," Mayor Johnson pointed out. "What we don't have is water." An hour later, Carl stood outside the shelter holding a Y-shaped device made from salvaged electrical conduit. He had bent the metal carefully, creating 2 arms that joined at a handle. It looked crude compared to the colony's advanced technology, but it felt right in his hands. How does this supposed to work? Beth asked, clearly skeptical. Carl closed his eyes and tried to remember his grandfather's instructions. You hold it like this with the arms pointing forward. Then you walk slowly and wait for it to pull down toward water. Pull down by itself? Dr. Hamilton asked. That's physically impossible. I don't know how it works, Carl admitted. I just know that it does. Beth crossed her arms. This is ridiculous. We should be focusing on real solutions, not magic tricks. 5 minutes, Jake said firmly. Give him 5 minutes to try. If nothing happens, we'll go back to digging test holes. Carl nodded and began walking slowly across the desert sand. He held the metal rod loosely in his hands, trying to feel for any movement. The device remained steady as he walked away from the crash site. Nothing, Beth muttered. Just like I said. Carl continued walking, following the path that Dr. Hamilton had identified as the old riverbed. His grandfather had always said that water left traces even long after it disappeared. He tried to open his mind to any sensation, any hint that water might be nearby. After 10 minutes of walking, he felt something different. The metal rod seemed to twitch in his hands just slightly. He stopped and tried again, taking a few steps in different directions. What is it? Dr. Hamilton called out. I'm not sure, Carl replied. Something feels different here. He walked in a small circle, and the rod definitely moved when he faced a certain direction. It was subtle, but it was there. The metal seemed to want to point downward, toward the ground. The rod is moving, he announced. Beth walked over to where he stood. I don't see anything. Here, try it yourself. Carl offered the device to her. Beth took the rod and held it the way Carl had shown her. She walked in the same pattern, but nothing happened. It's not doing anything for me. Maybe not everyone can do it, Carl said, taking the rod back. My grandfather said some people have the gift and others don't. When Carl held the device again, it immediately began to dip toward the ground. He followed the feeling, walking in a straight line across the desert. Every few steps, he stopped to test the rod's reaction. There's definitely something here, he said with growing excitement. The pull is getting stronger. Dr. Hamilton hurried over with her geological scanner. She ran the device over the area where Carl's rod was pointing most strongly. Wait a minute, she said, staring at her readings. I'm getting some unusual echoes from the subsurface. What kind of echoes? Jake asked. It could be a void space, maybe a cavern or underground channel. She looked at Carl with new respect. How did you know to look here? Carl shrugged. I didn't know. I just followed what the rod was telling me. Beth shook her head in amazement. This is impossible. A piece of bent metal can't detect underground water. But it just did, Mayor Johnson pointed out. The question is, what do we do now? Dr. Hamilton studied her scanner readings more carefully. If there really is water down there, we need to dig. But we're talking about excavating maybe 50 feet down through solid rock and sand. We have 800 people, Jake said, and we have time. More importantly, we have no choice. Carl walked around the area, testing different spots with his improvised dowsing rod. He found 3 places where the device reacted strongly. These spots all feel good, he reported, but this one feels the strongest. Dr. Hamilton marked the locations on her map. We'll start with the strongest signal and work our way down. If we organize digging crews and work around the clock, we might reach whatever's down there in a week. A week without much water, Beth said grimly. Then we better get started, Jake replied. Within an hour, the entire colony was organized into digging crews. They used every available tool, from emergency shovels to pieces of metal torn from the ship. The work was backbreaking under the hot alien suns, but nobody complained. As the day wore on, Carl continued to test the area with his rod. Each time, it pointed to the same spots, as if something below was calling to it. He couldn't explain how it worked, but he no longer doubted that it did. Your grandfather would be proud, Dr. Hamilton said as she watched him work. Carl wiped sweat from his face and looked at the growing excavation. I hope he's right about there being water down there, because if he's wrong, we're all in serious trouble. The dig continued through the night with crews working by the light of emergency flares. Nobody wanted to stop, because everyone knew their lives depended on what they might find below. The digging continued for 6 grueling days. The colonists worked in shifts around the clock, trading places every 4 hours to keep the excavation going. Their hands were raw and bleeding, their backs ached, and their water rations had been cut to barely enough to keep them alive. Carl Rodriguez stood at the edge of the deepest hole, watching the night crew dig by the light of emergency torches. They were down almost 60 feet now, and still no sign of water. Some people were starting to lose hope, whispering that maybe the dowsing rod was just wishful thinking. "How much deeper do we go?" asked Mayor Johnson, his voice hoarse from dehydration. Dr. Hamilton checked her geological scanner for the 100th time. "The readings are still showing something down there, but we might be looking at another 20 or 30 feet. "We don't have 20 or 30 feet worth of time," said Jake Morrison grimly. "People are starting to collapse from heat exhaustion and dehydration." Carl gripped his makeshift dowsing rod tighter. When he held it over the excavation site, it still pulled downward with the same insistent force it had shown from the beginning. Something was definitely down there, calling to be found. "One more day," he said firmly. "Give me one more day." "Carl," Beth Walker said gently, "maybe we need to try a different approach. We could look for water in other areas." "No," Carl shook his head. "It's here. I can feel it. My grandfather always said that when the rod pulls this strong, you're close." Jake studied the faces around him. The colonists were exhausted, dehydrated, and scared, but they had come this far based on faith in an old man's techniques. "One more day," he decided. "But after that, we have to consider other options." The next morning brought no relief from the heat. The 2 sons of Zarian Prime beat down mercilessly on the work crews. Several people had to be carried to the medical shelter suffering from heat stroke. The water supplies were now measured in hours, not days. Carl took his turn in the deep hole, swinging a pickaxe at the stubborn rock and sand. Every strike sent shockwaves through his tired arms, but he kept going. The dowsing rod lay beside him, and every few minutes he would pick it up to test the area. Still pointing down, he called up to the surface. "How can you be sure?" shouted down one of the other diggers. "Maybe the thing is broken." Carl wiped sweat from his eyes and tested the rod again. It remained perfectly still when he pointed it away from the dig site, but immediately dipped toward the ground when he aimed it downward. "It's not broken," he said. At midday, Dr. Hamilton lowered herself into the hole with her scanner. The device showed the same readings it had been showing for days, promising something just out of reach. "I'm reading a large void space about 15 feet below us," she reported, "but I can't tell what's in it." "Could be just an empty cave," said Beth from above. "Could be water," Carl replied stubbornly. The afternoon shift brought new energy to the dig. Word had spread through the colony that they were close to something, and volunteers lined up to take their turn with the shovels and picks. Even children, too young to dig, carried buckets of sand and rock away from the site. As the sun began to set, the diggers had reached a depth of 75 feet. The walls of the excavation were carefully shored up with metal beams salvaged from the ship, creating a narrow shaft that disappeared into darkness. Carl was working alone at the bottom when his pickaxe struck something different. Instead of the solid thunk of rock, he heard a hollow sound. He knelt down and brushed sand away from the area, revealing what looked like a thin layer of stone. "I think I found something," he called up. Jake Morrison rappelled down into the hole with emergency lights. The thin stone layer was clearly different from the surrounding rock. It looked almost like a natural ceiling over an empty space below. "This could be it," Jake said, his voice tight with excitement and fear. "But we need to be careful. If we break through and there's nothing down there, we've wasted our last chance." Carl positioned his dowsing rod over the stone surface. The metal device pulled downward so strongly that it almost jumped from his hands. "There's definitely something below this," he said with certainty. "Water?" Jake asked. "Has to be. The rod has never pulled this hard before." They worked carefully to create a small opening in the stone layer. Carl used a chisel and hammer to chip away at the edges while Jake held the lights. The work was slow and precise, because they couldn't afford to collapse whatever lay beneath. Finally, Carl managed to create a hole large enough to shine a light through. He aimed his flashlight into the opening and peered down. What he saw made him gasp. "Water," he whispered. "There's water down there." Jake pushed closer to look. Below them, maybe 10 feet down, was the surface of an underground lake. The water was dark and still, but it was definitely there. "How much?" he asked. Carl moved his light around, trying to see the edges of the underground chamber. "It's big," he said with growing excitement. "Really big. This isn't just a puddle, Jake. This is a whole underground lake." The news spread through the colony like wildfire. People who had been lying in the medical shelter, barely conscious from dehydration, suddenly found the strength to cheer. The digging crews worked with renewed energy to widen the opening. By midnight, they had created a hole large enough for a person to squeeze through. Carl volunteered to be the first one down, carrying a rope and a water testing kit. He rappelled into the underground chamber and found himself in a cavern that stretched beyond the reach of his flashlight. The water was cool and clear. Dr. Hamilton's portable testing equipment showed it was not only safe to drink but actually purer than most water sources on Earth. The underground lake appeared to be fed by natural springs, with fresh water constantly flowing in from somewhere deeper in the planet's crust. "It's good water," Carl shouted up through the hole. "And there's a lot of it." The first buckets of water were hauled to the surface an hour later. People lined up to receive their share, and for the first time in days, everyone drank their fill. Children laughed and splashed their faces. Adults cried with relief. But the discovery was bigger than just one underground lake. Over the next few hours, Carl used his dowsing rod to survey the entire area around their crash site. The metal device indicated water sources in dozens of locations, suggesting an entire network of underground rivers and lakes. "This planet isn't dead," Dr. Hamilton said in amazement as she studied the survey results. "The water is all here, just hidden underground." Mayor Johnson organized teams to begin accessing the other water sources. They had the tools and knowledge now to tap into the planet's hidden water system. What had seemed like certain death was turning into the foundation for a new life. Carl stood at the edge of the original excavation, holding his simple dowsing rod. The device that everyone had called superstition had saved their lives. He thought about his grandfather, who had learned the technique from his own grandfather, passing down knowledge that stretched back generations. "Thank you," he whispered, to the desert wind, knowing somehow that the old man would have been proud. 6 months had passed since the crash landing, and Zerion Prime looked nothing like the dead world the colonists had first encountered. Where once there had been only endless sand dunes, green patches now dotted the landscape around the human settlement. The sound of running water could be heard throughout the colony as irrigation channels carried life-giving water from the underground sources to every corner of their new home. Carl Rodriguez walked through the main agricultural area, checking on the crops that had seemed impossible just months ago. Tomatoes hung heavy on their vines. Corn stalks swayed in the desert breeze, and rows of vegetables stretched toward the horizon. The sight still amazed him every morning. "The soil analysis came back perfect," said Danny Chen, the colony's agricultural specialist. He had arrived on the ship as a backup farmer, never expecting to become the key to their survival. "Once we added water, all the nutrients were already here. This desert was just sleeping, waiting for someone to wake it up." The transformation had started slowly. After discovering the underground water network, the colonists had built a system of wells and pumps throughout the area. Dr. Hamilton had mapped over 30 separate water sources within walking distance of their crash site, each one connected to the vast underground river system. But the real surprise had come when they started irrigating the desert soil. Plants that had been dormant for decades suddenly sprouted from seeds that had been waiting in the sand. Native cane. Grasses appeared first, followed by flowering plants and eventually small trees. The desert had not been dead at all, just waiting for the right conditions to return. "Look at this," Danny said, pointing to a section where earth crops grew alongside alien plants. "The local species are actually helping our crops grow better. They're sharing nutrients through their root systems." Jake Morrison joined them, carrying a report tablet. As the colony's leader, he had watched their settlement grow from a desperate crash site into a thriving community. "The atmospheric readings are incredible," he said. "The increased plant growth has actually improved the air quality. We're producing more oxygen than we consume." The changes were visible from space, which is why the Zephyrian patrol ship had finally come to investigate. For months, their automated monitoring stations had been reporting impossible readings from Zirion Prime. Vegetation growth, where none should exist. Atmospheric changes that suggested active plant life. Life signs that kept increasing instead of decreasing. Commander Vexnar of the Zephyrian patrol vessel had dismissed the reports as sensor malfunctions. Everyone knew that Zirion Prime was a Class 5 death world. No species had ever survived more than a few days on its surface. But the readings had become so persistent that the Zephyrian High Command had finally ordered an investigation. "Approaching Zirion Prime now," reported the ship's navigator. "Sensors are confirming the anomalous readings. Significant vegetation growth detected across a wide area of the southern continent." Commander Vexnar studied the display with growing confusion. His species had surveyed this world thoroughly 50 years ago. Their scientists had concluded that the planet was permanently hostile to life. Yet the sensors clearly showed thriving plant communities, where their charts indicated only barren wasteland. "Could another species have terraformed the planet?" asked his science officer. "Impossible," Vexnar replied. "Terraforming takes centuries and requires massive technology. These readings suggest the changes happened in just a few months." The patrol ship entered the atmosphere and flew toward the source of the readings. What they found below defied everything the Zephyrians thought they knew about Zirion Prime. A settlement spread across several square miles, with buildings connected by flowing water channels. Green fields extended in all directions, and the wreckage of a crashed ship sat at the center of it all. "By the ancient stars," whispered the science officer. "Those are humans down there." Commander Vexnar had heard of humans but had never encountered them directly. They were supposed to be a young species, recently emerged from their home planet. According to Zephyrian records, they possessed no advanced technology and had limited space travel capabilities. "How did they get here?" he asked. "And how did they survive on a death world?" The patrol ship landed near the human settlement, and a delegation of Zephyrians emerged to meet the colonists. Commander Vexnar expected to find desperate survivors clinging to life with advanced technology. Instead, he found healthy, happy people who welcomed them with genuine warmth. "Welcome to New Eden," said Mayor Johnson, greeting the aliens with a smile. "We're honored to have visitors. Please join us for a meal and some fresh water." The Zephyrians followed the humans through their settlement, marveling at what they saw. Water flowed everywhere, supporting lush gardens and productive farms. Children played in irrigation ponds while adults tended to crops that should not have been able to grow in this environment. "This is impossible," Commander Vexnar said to Dr. Hamilton as she showed them around. "Our scientists declared this world uninhabitable. How did you find water where none should exist?" Dr. Hamilton smiled and pointed to Carl Rodriguez, who was demonstrating his dowsing technique to a group of fascinated Zephyrian scientists. "That man found water using a technique that's thousands of years old on our planet. He used a simple tool made from bent metal to locate underground sources that your surveys missed." The Zephyrian science officer examined Carl's dowsing rod with obvious confusion. "This device has no sensors, no computer systems, no power source. How does it detect water?" Carl shrugged, comfortable now with being the center of attention. "I don't really know how it works. My grandfather taught me that some people just have a feel for water. You hold the rod loose and let it guide you to where the water wants to be found." "That's not scientifically possible," the science officer protested. "Maybe not," Carl replied, "but it works. Would you like to try it?" The Zephyrian scientist took the rod and attempted to use it as Carl had shown him. Nothing happened. The metal remained perfectly still in his hands, showing no reaction to the water sources that Carl could locate easily. "Perhaps it only works for humans," Dr. Hamilton suggested. "We've found that not all humans can do it either. Carl seems to have a natural talent for it." Commander Vexnar was struggling to understand what he was seeing. But our orbital surveys showed no surface water, no underground rivers. How did you know where to look? We didn't, Jake Morrison explained. We were desperate and willing to try anything. Carl's technique led us to the first water source, and then we discovered that the entire planet has underground rivers. Your surveys only looked at the surface during the dry season. Dr. Hamilton showed them her geological maps. Xerion Prime has cyclical climate changes. You surveyed during the peak of the dry cycle when all the water is underground. But the water system never disappeared. It was just hidden. The Zephyrian delegation spent 3 days studying the human settlement. They analyzed the water sources, examined the agricultural systems, and tried to understand how a supposedly primitive species had accomplished what their advanced technology had deemed impossible. We must report this to the High Command, Commander, Vexnar finally said. This planet will need to be reclassified, and we need to understand how your species succeeded where ours failed. As the Zephyrian ship prepared to leave, Carl gave the commander a spare dowsing rod as a gift. Take this to your scientists, he said. Maybe they can figure out how it works. But remember, the most important part isn't the tool. It's being willing to listen to what the world is trying to tell you. The patrol ship lifted off, carrying news that would change how the Zephyrian Empire viewed both Xerion Prime and the humans who had transformed it. Below, the colonists continued their work, turning a dead world into a garden one water source at a time. The news of the human success on Xerion Prime spread through the Zephyrian Empire like wildfire. Within weeks of Commander Vexnar's report, ships from dozens of different worlds arrived to see the impossible transformation for themselves. Scientists, diplomats, and curious citizens all came to witness how a crashed human colony had turned a death world into a garden. Dr. Kethvar, the Empire's leading planetary scientist, stepped off his research vessel with a team of the galaxy's most respected experts. He had studied Xerion Prime's geology for decades and had personally signed the reports declaring it uninhabitable. Now he stood in a green meadow where his charts showed only barren sand should exist. This violates every principle of planetary science we know, he muttered to his assistant as they watched human children playing beside a flowing stream. Carl Rodriguez approached the group of alien scientists with his usual friendly manner. Word had spread that he was the human who had found the first water source, and every visitor wanted to meet him. In his hand, he carried the same simple dowsing rod that had started it all. Dr. Kethvar, I presume, Carl said, extending his hand in the human gesture of greeting. Dr. Hamilton told me you were coming. She's excited to share our geological findings with you. The Zephyrian scientist stared at the crude metal device in Carl's other hand. That is the instrument you used to locate underground water sources? That's right, Carl replied. Would you like to see how it works? Dr. Kethvar had brought the most advanced geological scanning equipment in the galaxy. His instruments could detect underground structures from orbit and analyze soil composition down to the molecular level. The idea that a bent piece of metal could outperform his technology seemed absurd. Please demonstrate, he said, barely hiding his skepticism. Carl walked to an area where no wells had been dug yet. He held the dowsing rod loosely in his hands and began walking slowly across the ground. Within minutes, the rod began to dip toward the earth. There's water here, Carl announced. Maybe 40 feet down. Dr. Kethvar immediately activated his scanning equipment. The readings showed exactly what Carl had predicted, an underground water channel approximately 40 feet below the surface. The Zephyrian scientist stared at his instruments in disbelief. How did you know? He demanded. What sensors are hidden in that device? Carl handed him the rod. No sensors. Just metal conduit from our ship. Try it yourself. The alien scientist examined the rod carefully, looking for any trace of advanced technology. He found nothing but bent metal. When he attempted to use it, as Carl had demonstrated, nothing happened. The rod remained motionless in his hands. I don't understand, Dr. Kethvar said in frustration. There must be some scientific explanation. Maybe there is, Carl replied. but I don't know what it is. I just know it works for some humans. My grandfather taught me that water calls to water, and some people can hear that call. Over the following days, dozens of alien scientists attempted to use Carl's dowsing rod. None of them could make it work. Even when Carl showed them exactly how to hold it and where to walk, the device remained stubbornly inactive in their hands. Dr. Hamilton organized a joint research project to study the phenomenon. Human and alien scientists worked together, trying to understand how dowsing functioned. They tested different materials, different techniques, and different environments. The results were always the same. Some humans could use the technique successfully, while aliens could not. "We've discovered something remarkable," Dr. Hamilton announced to the assembled researchers. "It appears that certain humans have a sensitivity to underground water that we don't fully understand. It might be electromagnetic, gravitational, or something else entirely, but it's definitely real." The discovery had implications far beyond Zarian Prime. The Zephyrian Empire began recruiting human water finders to help with colonization efforts on dry worlds throughout the galaxy. Planets that had been written off as uninhabitable were suddenly being reconsidered. Mayor Johnson found himself hosting delegations from hundreds of different species. New Eden, as the colonists had named their settlement, became a center of interspecies cooperation and learning. The crash site that had once seemed like a death sentence was now the heart of a thriving community. "We want to establish a permanent research station here," announced Ambassador Thexdal of the Zephyrian High Council. "Your people have shown us that there are forms of knowledge we haven't considered. We would like to learn from you." Jake Morrison, now serving as the human representative to the galactic community, smiled at the irony. "6 months ago, you would have left us here to die. Now you want to build a research station." "We were wrong," the ambassador admitted. "We assumed that advanced technology was always superior to primitive methods. Your people have shown us that wisdom doesn't always come from machines." The research station quickly grew into something much larger. Scientists from across the galaxy came to study not just dowsing, but other traditional human techniques that might have applications on alien worlds. The colonists shared their knowledge freely, teaching anyone who wanted to learn. Carl became the station's first instructor in water-finding techniques. He established a school where humans could learn the ancient art from experienced practitioners. To everyone's surprise, children seemed to have the best success with dowsing. Young humans who had never heard of the technique could often use it successfully on their first try. "Maybe it's something we lose as we get older," Carl explained to a class of mixed human and alien students. "Children don't overthink it. They just feel what the rod is telling them." The school's most successful student was a 10-year-old girl named Lucy, who had been born on the ship during the journey to their original destination. She could find water sources that even Carl missed, and her dowsing rod seemed to react more strongly than anyone else's. "The water is singing," she told Dr. Hamilton during one of her lessons. "Can't you hear it?" Dr. Hamilton listened carefully but heard only the wind blowing across the desert. "What does it sound like?" "Like it's happy to be found," Lucy replied, skipping toward another water source that her rod had detected. The New Eden Accords were signed 2 years after the crash landing. The document established Zarian Prime as a joint colony under human leadership, with research facilities open to all species. The planet was reclassified from a death world to a garden world, becoming a symbol of how cooperation and open minds could overcome seemingly impossible challenges. Carl Rodriguez stood at the memorial they had built near the crash site of the New Horizon. The monument honored not just the colonists who had survived, but the ancient knowledge that had saved them. Carved into the stone were the words his grandfather had taught him: "Water calls to water, and wisdom flows from generation to generation." Alien. Children now played in the gardens that surrounded the memorial, learning from human teachers how to listen to the world around them. The desert planet that was supposed to be deadly had become a place where different species learned from each other, where ancient wisdom and advanced technology worked together to create something better than either could achieve alone. As the twin suns set over New Eden, Carl smiled and walked home along the flowing irrigation channels that had made it all possible. In his pocket, he carried the same simple dowsing rod that had changed everything, ready to teach the next generation that sometimes the most powerful tools are also the simplest ones.